I'll try to be as brief as possible given the time limits that I'm working with. My presentation is about a specific case study, sexual harassment in India. Briefly, so I had long-standing interest in violence, particularly corporate violence by multinational companies. So that's how I began my career. And then I shifted to violence within corporations, that is on worker violence on fellow workers, and into domestic violence, and eventually to in public spaces. But public spaces happened in 2012 after this infamous Nirbhaya case. As you saw yesterday, a presentation on that. And so that's how I got into this, looking at violence, but in a very specific areas. So the primary objective is to look at, I focus on offenders. We heard a lot yesterday from the victim's perspective, and today I want to talk a little bit about the offending patterns and self-reported behaviors, and also throw in some comparisons between gender differences in terms of how they perceive the seriousness of the violence, where it happens, and why it occurs. So I went through, listening to a lot of presentations yesterday. I sat up all night trying to change my presentation to make it a little more interesting, because I'm so used to presenting this very technical, conference presentations, where, all the statistics and the methods part. So I try to kind of mix it up to at least to keep you awake in the presentation. Again, I'll quickly run through the slides. Some of the slides you already heard. I don't want to spend too much time. I just want to get to some of the more interesting differences that we found in this research. So, changing role of women in society, but keeping in mind India is a very interesting case study, only apart from being a post-colonial society. And as much as they tout themselves to be the most democratic and the biggest democratic country in the world, the kind of problems that the country faces is just so humongous simply because of the population size. I don't want to go through this particular slides and what constitutes, but we followed the definition that Jagori, an NGO organization, and the UN Women research, which identified certain behaviors as sexual harassment. We also talk briefly about public spaces. The one key thing is, what is public space in India is that the second point, the third point in the slide you see is that from a patriarchal perspective, which India is, if women are not in the house, if they're in public, it means that women are not in the house. So it's a very critical, perspective of how traditionally men view the role of women. So this particular slide, I just wanted to talk about how we define public space and what the literature talks about public space. There's a lot of research in general about sexual harassment in public spaces. These are some examples. And yesterday you saw Vanya's presentation where she talked about comparison of various countries about sexual harassment. In India, there was little work on sexual harassment. There's pre-Nirbhaya era and the post-Nirbhaya era. But again, the kind of research that's done is limited. People are doing it now, but it's in nascent stages. Theoretical contributions we have seen yesterday, as well as in existing literature of gender-related perspectives relating to violence against women. There is the agency, the patriarchy, masculinity perspectives that talk about the violence against women. And from mainstream criminology, and as Anastasia just mentioned about some of the more classical theories relating to why people commit crime, and which is the Beckerian, Bentham models of the rationality and why human beings engage in behaviors of this nature. But theories that came out of those perspectives, those larger ideological underpinnings, are theories such as the routine activities theory, the learning theories, neutralization theories, and the more recent ones, and some of you I was talking yesterday who'd been to ECHA meetings, very familiar with the situational crime prevention theories that Ron Clark proposed in 1980s, and still it's a very popular classical perspective in criminology. In the corporate sectors, that is the biggest perspective that they go with in trying to deal with problem solving. And those of you who are familiar with Zedner and others in terms of crime governance, and pre-crime areas. They all talk about this perspective. Even the Norwegian criminologist Katja Stanko also talks about globalization and how things are changing in the neoliberal democracies in terms of what crime is and how it is defined and how it's controlled. So we did a survey based on items from Jagori, UN Women, and the location is India. And as you can see, I just put a little thing in red, which is where I grew up in India before I went to the US for my studies, doctoral studies. So Delhi is northern part with the red little block there you see. And this is the city of Delhi where my study was done. And this data was collected and some translation was done with the help of my former doctoral student who grew up in Delhi, and he's very familiar with Hindi. I grew up in the South, and my Hindi is smattering, not really fluent. Just some visuals about, when you talk about sexual harassment, I think without a context of how and where and how it looks like, it's difficult. If you take a transit system that Anastasia talked about in Los Angeles, the kind of background may be very different than when you look at Delhi. In Delhi, you can't walk 2 feet without bumping into people. And so that is the density of the population. So you've got to keep sexual harassment in that context. And this is a very normal thing about school kids running back. And even I did the very thing when I was growing up, even though I grew up in a very small city on the coast. It was always, often I traveled just hanging on to just hanging onto the footboard because there are no doors. So you just hang on to your dear life when you go from place to place. This is the metro station, one of the metro stations in Delhi. And so look, this is the office going time, office coming, returning time. So all these are critical factors. Public spaces. You go to a bazaar. This is, I think, in Old Delhi. And again, this is part of during the festive season. This is how they look. Even India Gate, which is a central park, which is supposedly one of the biggest parks in Delhi, you will find a lot of people there. These are some examples of eve teasing. In India, they call it eve teasing for sexual harassment. This is the male perspective. The male word is eve teasing. And normally takes place in group settings. So you would have 2 or 3 people there. Rarely see one single, individual going out and doing this. So, and the last slide, the fourth one to the right-hand side is a video I don't want to show now, but it's about 2 sisters in a bus beat up the guy who harassed one of the sisters. And the bystanders did nothing. They just watched. And keep in mind, this bus was not that crowded. There are laws against, after Nirbhaya case, there were laws, expanded legal framework for including many behaviors. One of the things I have an issue with this is, and I'm still working on this, is I'm not trained legally, but I'm working with a law scholar to analyze the legal situation where there's a word they use as outraging a woman's modesty. And I have no idea what that means, to be honest with you. And again, I think I'm a little educated person, but I don't know if I don't have background about legal matters and analysis. I do not know what they think about what modesty is. And so they do spell it out, but again, it's a complex issue, and it's a research project in itself. So it's not no time or format for this analysis. Again, you can see I was burning the candle both ends last night, and I see a spelling error there. This is, again, a slide I created last night to show the differences in crimes against women per 100,000 population, Delhi versus all India, to show the comparison of the amount of crimes against women. We did a survey based on the identified characters. We identified 20 different behaviors, and we did a stratified sampling looking at by age, by gender, by social security, social status, and occupation. So these are the 4 categories: nonverbal, verbal, physical less serious, and physical more serious. And these are the 20 behaviors we included in the survey. We trained 20 University of Delhi students with the survey. They're back translated. And these are the demographics. So we chose 55%. We oversampled females slightly more, and males 44%. And these, we also included caste, which I don't know why we did it, but we included that as well, besides the social class. So the findings in general is that the victimization in public spaces, you see they happen in public transit, about 87%, in public areas, 83%, and school work, 31%, and a breakdown of places where victimization occurs. So you see that the taxi, that is a 3-wheeler rickshaws, taxis also, there's a fairly high percentage. But these are not inclusive. This is the incident rate and not necessarily the prevalence rate. We asked about the gender difference. We looked at the gender differences for this, how serious these behaviors are, and as expected, you would find that there will be differences, slight differences. But these differences are statistically significant. That is the difference between males and females. We asked them, why does it happen? And we looked at the gender differences, and there are misperceptions. Actually, there are misperceptions relating to why it occurs. What we did was we looked at global perceptions and then the offender's perception. And you see that there are very marked differences between what people think why it happens in general versus the offenders themselves as to why it happens. And you see, she was not dressed appropriately according to Indian culture, but more like a Westerner. And so you see the big differences. And these are all statistically very, very significant, strong. The t-values are very, very high for each one of these items. But again, these are the different categories. Because she was all alone, the police wouldn't have done anything if the women complained. She asked for it since she was wearing revealing clothes. So most of them are victim blaming issues, but there are differences. There are also differences between victims and self-reported offenders about the nature of these behaviors. So for example, unwanted deliberate pinching, touching towards the end, you see exposing genitals, masturbation in front of the women. All these, you see the differences in various categories. But again, they are fairly distinct. We only looked at the strongly agree, strongly agree, and very strongly agree. Why do you engage in sexual harassment? Okay, so we looked at the males. Out of 621 males, we found close to 50% saying, yes, they admitted to having done that. And these are the percentages of people, why they did it. She was alone was the highest, and the last one was agreed to go on a date. So in between, you see that the patriarchy or the agency and cultural stereotypes coming in the way, like, dressed as a Westerners, police wouldn't do anything. And interestingly, she didn't seem married, was also one of the things, and that's an interesting item for us, is that, again, we can have an entire paper on that, looking at, analyzing that particular one. We also asked, did you do this? Do you know a male friend who has done it? So we wanted to see the difference between personal versus I know a male friend. And you see that they know more people who have done that versus their own. But it also gets into the survey data validity about in terms of how honestly they're responding to these questions. But what we make out of that is that they're doing it in the presence of other friends, even though our data does not capture that. But that's the future research, because that's one of the things in retrospect we feel that we have not included the question, were you alone or with other people when you did this? And which we can draw from qualitative data. So the dependent variable is sexual harassment is dichotomous, and we had independent variables. We used egalitarian and masculinity gender-based theories for operationalizing our variables, and the mainstream criminological theories of classical rational choice perspectives, including RAT, which is the routine activities theory, which also includes suitable target from SCP, that is situational crime prevention. These are the scales, and they're all, alphas are very high, except for suitable target. It's close to 0.7, which is not bad, and they're all loaded well. And this is the ordinary least square regressions, and you see some support for gender theories of masculinity and education, but no support for situational crime prevention or routine activities theory for the larger audiences. However, we did the analysis without including friend, and we found a direct relationship between a suitable target and no guardianship. They're very significant. But when we included friend into it, the strength of the relationship between these predictor variables disappeared. So which means that we still need to figure out what is happening. Is it the question of operationalization of our variables, or whether the relevance of Western theories to Indian context? So these are, we still need to tease out, but these are, and then you see the 4 columns. We did for everyone, we did for nonverbal, we did for verbal, and we did for physical. But here, I think there's a problem there in terms of what a nonverbal, a verbal, and a physical means. Because the survey questions, yes, in our heads, we're very clear. This is the behavior Jagori and UN used. However, when the people are responding to it, we're not so sure what actually that means to them. So there's, again, this is as a preliminary research, we see that we find some interesting differences. Suitable target is only for physical, but not for nonverbal and verbal. And so we have to do further analysis for that. We also asked people why they did not respond. Again, victim blaming came out to the top one. They said, police, afraid police will trouble me. I was afraid to approach police. People start blaming me for my appearance. Parents advised me not to report. People question my character. It's an everyday thing I'm used to. I'm embarrassed, ashamed, and I'm scared to discuss harassment with everyone. So it's a lot of victim blaming happening. Police legitimacy clearly is not very high, so they don't approach the police. The male gender differences are there, but still they're afraid of, they don't have any trust in police. Criminal justice effectiveness, some gender differences, just interesting. Laws are effectively enforced by police and sexual, it's in the negative. So you see that a lot of people don't believe that it is done well. How do we enhance safety for women? There are gender differences, but we talked about various items. Some of them are presented yesterday in terms of the apps to discuss about what can be done to make it more effective. These are all their own responses. How can you make it better or improve the condition? And lastly, what are the next things? We heard many suggestions yesterday, and I don't want to spend on that, but the one thing I want to focus on now, given the limited time, is the curriculum changes in preschool and grade school level. And I think this is a long-range investment. You plant the seed now, because you hope for a generation, that's 15, 20 years from now that may probably capture something. To me, that is one of the key approaches to long-term investment in changing the culture. I'm very familiar with the organizational behavior literature. It happens only in corporations. They can change it in a very small setting. You're talking about 1.3 billion population. And to make change, to bring change, it is not an easy task. It requires a little bit of long-range planning. And the second thing is that Indians are crazy about Bollywood heroes, heroines, and cricket stars. And if they can incorporate and bring them into media using every week, like a television series. There was one episode, there was one series by a hero's name, star's name, Salman Khan, I think. And he had a show, and he would talk about social problems every week. I think their services could be, media can work towards bringing these people to kind of spread the message. So I close with those remarks. Thank you.
Fantastic presentations, and I think also a very interesting example of this two very different contexts, but also your different perspectives on one hand, the spatial physical conditions, and in your case also really understanding the people behind what's happening. So I will give you one mic here, and then I will open up, and we'll run a little bit into lunch. I've got the permission to do that, to open up for questions to our two presenters. And do we have a mic that we pass around, Vanya? Or, yeah? Okay, so who wants to? Yes, here we have a question. Okay, I might repeat your question just for the, no. Okay.
So I'm trying to think, just based on your experience in this, how would you think about structuring this particular kind of education effort to young children?
Okay, so I'll just repeat for the sake of the film as well. So the question around really starting early, how does this work with a child's perspective on these issues is, of course, very different from an adult's perspective. So, is it?
Hello?
Is it on mute? Or is it?
Yes, good question. I mean, you don't talk about sex and sex education at an early age. But I think the underlying premise for me is that considering the girl sitting next to you is equal to you, number one. And number two, that she can be and do what you can do. Public space is not just for males, because in India, public space is seen very, very different by males and females. And we heard a lot of that from other research, from other parts of the country in terms of how they view. So the idea at that early stage in preschool and school is to create this environment and making it clear that they are no different than you. Because at home, they're receiving messages, oh, you're a boy. You shouldn't be in the kitchen. what are you doing in the kitchen? You should be out there doing something else. But the daughter is in the kitchen. So these messages are very firm and they are entrenched, and if they are not contradicted and challenged in schools, early school system, and that sets the tone. And grade school, yes, in the US, in grade schools, they introduce sex education in a very subtle way. I mean, you know, as an American, you understand where it begins about sex education. So in that sense, my view is that preschool, it's not, we don't introduce sexual harassment in preschool, but the idea of respect and equality and fairness and equal sharing of resources is a starting point.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Can I add? I want to say just that it is a starting point, but in the US it's not enough. I mean, there is sexual education, as you say, from very early, but you saw in the Los Angeles example that sexual harassment on transit is quite pervasive. So
Exactly.
we really need to talk about also other approaches as well.
And yeah.
We educate them slowly because that's the time they're starting to learn and they're curious about their own body. So there's a way of learning and there's a system how you do it. So the people who are trained to do it actually do that. So that's how we introduce sex education. He rightly said you don't talk about harassment, but if they understand nobody can touch you on your breast because that's your private part, if somebody does it, they know it's wrong. So they can talk about it.
That's just to repeat that you're saying that there are, of course, pedagogical ways of dealing with body integrity and so forth. Yeah. Okay. Another question?
I have a question for Anastasia. So I'm curious whether you've done any research on smart growth and how that may relate to transit safety in particular, or whether you have any hypotheses.
Smart growth?
Smart growth, yeah.
Okay.
Which kind of, influences mixed design use and
Yes.
safety and so on.
Yes. Well, smart growth kind of talks for more compact cities. As I mentioned earlier, different types of crime happen under different situations. So typically we found in Los Angeles that the more serious crime, what FBI calls type 1 crime, which is the rape, but also aggravated assault and all that, does not happen in desolate bus stops. So if you have more mixed uses, it's better because there are people around, as you can imagine, more natural surveillance. On the other hand, other types of crime, like pickpockets or snatching, chains and all that, do happen. That's why, if you remember, we did find more crime near retail areas. So it depends on the type of environment. And so in certain cases, smart growth, mixed use are helpful. In others, they may lead to more crime, and that's where you have to start thinking and differentiating, and some of the approaches need to be much more targeted to the particular situation you have.
Okay. More questions? Yes?
The perception of some of the incidents maybe could be that police do nothing. The perception that create pragmatic consequences.
Yes, it's a very valid scientific question. I mean, how do you cross-check this? As I said, this is a perceptual study. So this is their perception and their experiences. And again, we also saw a huge difference between actual perceptions versus behavior. As one of the slides I showed that there's a global perception seem to be very much exaggerated relative to those of people who actually are engaged in that behavior. So yes, that's point number one. Point number two is that police legitimacy is a serious concern in India. And again, I'm saying legitimacy. I'm using the word legitimacy with a very, very big quotation marks, because honestly, I don't know what that word means in India. If you use legitimacy, honestly, I have no idea what that means. But in the Western world, we use these phrases as if they are applicable across cultures. It doesn't. It simply doesn't. But I would substitute that word in saying confidence. Or do you trust the police to do something for you if you report? What we see is that we did another study in Delhi. The trust and legitimacy in police is very less. And I compared this with self-reported police officers' behavior who don't trust the people. Part of the problem in India is that in the Western world, as a comparison, you see, if you think about a policeman, he is seen as he's a representative of the community whose job it is to protect the community member. In the US, it happens at a very, very local level. Okay. In India, the police is a representative of the state. You can say a state is people, for people. But in people's heads, from a post-colonial perspective, you have to keep in mind how people think about what police are. Actually, even at this stage, when I'm traveling in India and a policeman stops me, actually I'm afraid. So you have to keep that in perspective as to how people view. I work with a lot of police, by the way, in India. They don't give me a lot of access to the data, but I do work with police because it's a very closed society. You can't have access. But from a scientific perspective, I appreciate your question, but no, this is completely perceptual.
Okay.
That in Los Angeles, believe it or not, also the Latino and African American communities have responded that they really are afraid of the police for different reasons. There is social profiling, particularly of the African American community, and Latino communities are very afraid, a number of them, that they may be deported, especially, unfortunately, under the present administration that you all know, and I don't need to go into. So a lot of them are they would never report to the police, and so you have to start thinking about other. So a number of them have mentioned, for example, in surveys, that if the transit agency has its own, so these are not the policemen, it's not the LAPD, they're the transit agency security guards. Or if you have staffing, people who collect the tickets, there is an additional element that really makes people less afraid and they feel they can go and report. So you really, as a policymaker, you really have to start thinking of these ways, because some of the most vulnerable folks who really are transit dependent are Latinos and African Americans. And if they are not going to report to the police, that's, using police is not very effective.
Okay. No more question. I actually had one thought, or one. I am curious about what in the first presentation here. I understand the terms that were, that there are mentioned of like negative factors. There are liquor stores. There are rundown houses and so forth that are from a pure. Like a perspective, you can see that these are negative factors for crime rates. But how do you reflect on when these phenomena, let's say, are like targeted as negative? On the other hand, a liquor store is part of a community. It's something that takes place. It's like, so how do you reflect on this? Like, when on one hand we can see like correspondence, and of course it's a good preventive measure. We can work with that as a method. But that it also gets this negative value. For example, one could take a more radical example is that, certain people are sort of threatening, but when they get labeled as negative presence, it's a very tough. It's not. It would be interesting to hear your reflection on that.
Yeah, I understand your point that you're stigmatizing certain. Well, all I was reporting and finding is that the exact location of a bus stop next to a liquor store, statistically, at least in my sample, was leading to more crime. And all you're saying is not to close the liquor store, but move the bus stop
Yeah, exactly.
2 feet away so
Exactly.
that it is in a more, a better surveyed
Yeah.
location. It is not, so you can move the bus stop up
exactly.
or down. It is not necessary to have it
Yeah.
extremely next to
Yeah.
the liquor store.
And then, of course, it gets more difficult or tricky when it's relating to certain groups of people and so forth, how you engage with it. But
Yes,
yeah, yeah.
absolutely. And you do find more crime near areas where you have younger people. Does this mean that we have to be?
No younger people.
Absolutely not.
No, exactly.
But it is good to know some of these things because it may lead to different types of interventions. You may have
exactly.
more staff in an area, and especially you know that crime peaks when the school, at the end of the school hours. So you may want to have more staff around to prevent certain things, to prevent harassment. So it's good to know these things, but I agree with you, there is a danger sometimes to kind of stigmatize people and places.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you wanted to have also a final commentary.
I just want to thank Vanya for her kind invitation to be here, and to KDH for your hospitality, for keeping us well fed, well caffeinated, and well hydrated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay.
We should